If I'm going to make a website, to me, the exciting thing is giving people control and giving people interaction and giving people access.
Hello, and welcome to PodRocket, a web development podcast brought to you by LogRocket. I'm Noel, and today we have Miriam Suzanne, web developer, artist, and co-founder of OddBird, here to talk about the design of web design. In this episode, Miriam and I talk about the tension of web design, the cascade of CSS, and the origins of the important property. So here's our episode with Miriam Suzanne. How's it going, Miriam?
Oh, it's going all right. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. I'm excited for this one. I feel like this meta discussion about the way in which we use tools is something that doesn't happen super often. I'm excited to dig in a little bit.
Oh, that's good to hear because it's an obsession of mine and I always feel like it's a little out there.
I think there is an appetite for it. It's just, there's also something, I think a lot of people that are in the front end space, they're very like results driven. Like they want to see that something on the page drawn immediately. Yeah. So it's easy to just be like, okay, like what's the newest thing I can use without a breath? And back end engineers are more like into that. No, I want to like think about the meta of what the interface
right. What are the implications or something?
Exactly. But I think that there is interesting crossover when that arrow is pointing the other direction. So I guess, yeah, on that note, how do you think that your background in art and engineering and advocacy has led to this more thoughtful approach, this different angle of the meta discussion of design on the front end itself?
I think it's maybe a pretty direct link. This is the stuff that got me interested in web design in the first place. I was doing theater and writing and other art forms, and part of what I was interested in was audience interaction and the relationship between the artist and the audience, and nonlinear work and interactive work and stuff like that. And the web has all that for reasons. Like that's the vision of the web from the start. And so as soon as I started playing with CSS and reading about why it was like this, I got really obsessed with this strange language. HTML semantics, even, not just CSS, but semantics in HTML are that. It's not just about what appears on the page. You can't quite do it with a WYSIWYG editor. There's something weird going on here. And I became obsessed with that weirdness.
That history of like early HTML and CSS, when looking at these tools now, it feels like they were very much designed like with the user in mind, right? There is utility to getting all this stuff done, but it was very rigid. And then like over time, we're like, we want to have a little bit more like flexibility, make things look cool. Like we wound up with all this weird CSS stuff where it was like these things that are at odds with each other. And there was a lot of kind of foot guns introduced over time and great power, great responsibility, all that jazz. And yeah, the web is weird in that way. Again, I think this space is weird in its challenges. Do you think that there's been any like major kind of missteps historically that have made this so tricky? Or do you think it is just kind of like this is the natural progression of where these tools, HTML, CSS have?
Yeah, a lot of the trickiness. There have been missteps in syntax or various things. It's a mess out here. It's a lot of different companies and different people trying to figure out solutions. But part of this is intrinsic to the problem that HTML and CSS are trying to solve, which is a fundamentally different problem than anybody else is dealing with. Most software is built for a platform. And once you have a platform, you know a lot about it. And you can design for a consistent place that you're going to put the thing. It's going to show up on PCs. We pick the platform and then we can design for it. And we know there's not a lot of variables, or we know the variables that are there. I'm coming more out of print design as my background. I wasn't doing any sort of code before I got into HTML and CSS. But coming out of print design, that's fundamentally different too, right? We know everything about the page. When I send something to the printer, I can tell them what paper to print it on, the size of the paper, whether or not there's margins, how to cut it, what inks to use. I can be very precise about everything. And if I say a 12 pixel font, I get back 12 pixel font. 12 point, whatever, like everything.
It's a number of inches tall, like, regardless.
Exactly. Yeah. It's going to be that number of inches tall. And it's never going to overflow the page.
Right.
Like, I know the size of the page. There's no surprises. And the sort of pitch for the web is, what if instead the user can bring their own needs and preferences to every document? So I'm just providing information and I'm marking it up so that you can say, I need paragraphs to look like this and I need headings to look like this for my use. And so it's entirely user and browser controlled. And browsers initially still referred to in specs as the user agent. The user they're choosing their agent to render the page, and then they're providing their preferences. So the initial web, and if you look at the initial website, the info.cern.ch, and you click through to technical limitations, it says, in order for this to work across all platforms and all sort of rendering contexts and for all users, that implies no control over fonts or colors, for example. We're not going to have design on the web. And that's the initial pitch for the web, is there will not be design. And so CSS doesn't happen until the image tag comes out. And there's some building sort of like, wouldn't it be nice if the web was more visually interesting? But when the image tag lands, suddenly people can do web design. Now you can do fonts and colors, but you lose everything that makes HTML special. So there was a real fear, and I think it's a quote from Holcomb Lee, who proposed CSS. He says, the web could have become a fax machine where we're just sending pictures back and forth. And so we're trying to solve this problem of how do we give web authors some ability to suggest design without taking away the ability for it to appear anywhere on any platform, on any device, with complete user control. And that means across languages, across writing modes, across device interfaces, not just screen sizes, but like maybe devices without screens. It's a pretty absurd ask.
Yeah, for sure. Especially because I think that it's an ask presents like a spectrum, right? I think it'd be easier if it were like, okay, this is the data layer, and then there's a subset of users that are just going to turn off CSS entirely. I think that it's tricky there because it's like, well, you don't want to have to say you either get all or nothing, right? All of the CSS overhead or nothing. But I think that notion can be very tempting because there's a sizable cohort of users that are just like, nah, it's going to look exactly how I'm like specking it. There's nothing fancy about their device. Like, why don't I just make all my CSS like very opinionated? Maybe I've got one mobile version and one desktop version. Do you think that there is any kind of credence to that? Let CSS be very strongly typed and opinionated for a given layout or site, like design spec in general, and then let users opt out if they don't want any of it? Or do you think that it's worth pursuing this spectrum of like functionality and display size and all that stuff?
I don't know what's worth it for you.
Yeah, sure.
To me, I'm like, that's what is special here. Why would I not do it? I can go make a poster if I want to make a poster. If I'm going to make a website, to me, the exciting thing is giving people control and giving people interaction and giving people access. I think this is a core accessibility concern. I'm trying to remember a talk I saw basically suggesting the key to accessibility isn't just that you get everything right in some sense of what's right, the right contrast or something, but that you give people control, because some people are going to get headaches in light mode and some people are going to get headaches in dark mode, right? And there's not a right answer to light mode or dark mode. There's user needs and preferences. And so we give people that control. Now our site is more accessible because people can adjust it. Some people need lower contrast. Some people need higher contrast. CSS is designed to make it possible for us to say, okay, great, here's a baseline, adjust as you need to.
I'm curious how you think about that, the balance between intent, right? Like, say your whole brand is like very light and bubbly. No, we want light mode is our whole thing. How do you reconcile this? Yes, but then we need dark mode, and we need to even the spending time developing it. Even that discussion aside, like, where is the line of no, we want this to be like a bright experience. That's the whole thing. Versus like it being configurable.
Yeah, I think that's the whole question of CSS, right? That's the fundamental problem. Some people are out here with brands.
Exactly.
And want to express those brands. And then how do you do that while giving people control? And I think it's one of the things that's shifted over the years. You look at the early debates about CSS and how it should work, and classes aren't really a thing. Selectors are pretty simple. You're styling the basic semantic elements of HTML. So everybody's style sheet looks roughly similar in terms of what's being selected. And so when you're working at that level, everybody's style sheets are basically interchangeable across documents. So like one of the demos in the first CSS proposal is you could take the New York Times and you replace the style sheet with the Le Monde style sheet, and you would get their branding, but on the New York Times content. And it's, yeah, that's pretty cool. That's not viable anymore. We're doing something a little bit more complicated. I can't just go grab somebody else's style sheet and apply it to my site and expect it to work. So there is some balance there. I think, like in terms of light and dark specifically, one of the things I would think about is there are lighter and darker light modes. If we think of light mode as just being dark text on a light background, and there are lighter and darker dark modes, these things don't have to be something that we think about in terms of a binary. There are ways we can play with preferences. Similarly, I think it's good to remember that prefers reduced motion, which is a media query we have and a preference people can set, is not prefers no motion, it's prefers reduced motion. And there's a reason for that. We want to avoid things that are going to cause vertigo or something, but it might still be useful to have something grow from where it is so that we maintain context. Like there's useful motion and then extraneous motion. And can we parse out what is reduced? Yeah, where can we find ways to hold on to our brand or our creativity or whatever while giving people some ability to, I don't know, adjust the sliders a bit?
Yeah, tweak it. Is there, I think this is an interesting multivariable problem, right? I think that a lot of the trick here comes into that, especially when one has extremely specific rules being applied for things like that. And like it is easy to kind of run into traps or hit cases where it's like, oh yeah, everything works well when the user agent flips from prefers light to prefers dark, except for we forgot this one piece of text because it's some weird thing we're pulling in from externality or something. Is there an easier way to be doing this type of development without just repeatedly having these things? Or do you have to just learn from experience and kind of know, oh, we've got to remember that users may have weird style sheet preferences?
Yeah, I don't know. Because they're for me the most interesting part of the language. That's why I'm here and what I want
It's
to
hard
play with.
to move
So
on that, I'm sure.
yeah, it's a little hard to answer. I think part of the tension that we're talking about is a tension of corporations versus users, and that feels like a more and more stressful and relevant topic as software seems to move farther and farther away from what people want. So to me, I feel like there's a right side of that. And then there's the side that's probably paying your salary. And those are different sides, maybe. And it's hard to answer that question when I think users should get more control and we need to be a little bit softer about what is a brand. But I also understand that, I don't know, Figma might disagree with me or something.
Yeah. I think there's two fronts. Yeah, there's like the brand opinionation front that we're talking about. And either the tooling isn't there yet, or maybe it never will be. And the more edge cases one has to handle, there's always going to be a little bit of extra work for those. And again, I think the tooling will get better and make that easier over time. But I think that there is additional energy that needs to be put into thinking about these edge cases, that is like the core of that tension. It is
Although
getting,
I
go
would
ahead.
say also that
Yeah.
sort of CSS is specifically designed to make that as easy as possible. Andy Bell's quote is, "Don't be the micromanager of the browser." Look up Andy Bell. Be the browser's mentor, not the micromanager, which is what CSS is designed for. The whole cascade, people have come to dislike it for a number of reasons, and I can go into a lot of detail on the reasons I think that sort of happened over time. Some of it is mistakes in the language, and some of it is people misunderstanding what it's doing, but it's there for helping us to do this. It exists so that we don't have to specify all of the styles. The whole point is that some things happen for us automatically if we're smart about it. And so when I think about falling back for older browsers, or I think about adjustments for user needs, in my work, they're usually pretty small. I'm trying to think about it from the start in a way where I'm not causing big problems for myself. I am keeping animations reasonable, and then I can add here and there a small reduced animation thing that just a couple properties. I can make light mode and dark mode just toggle some variables. Nothing else really changes. There's a lot that I can do with only some sort of small edits. There's a lot I can do with progressive enhancements. I've been using Subgrid for years, and it's only recently supported in all browsers, but a 2-line fallback worked fine in most cases. And nobody needed to know that it was better in a few other browsers.
Yeah. I want to roll back a little bit. I want to talk about the cascade in particular, because I think this is a thing where it's, like then people just getting into CSS alike, kind of, it's easy not to think about it, right? That's kind of the background mechanism. But you mentioned how useful it is as an abstraction to help solve this problem. And it isn't always just annoyance that people feel. This is kind of back to my earlier question. Is there some fundamental disconnect here in like the semantics of CSS and supporting these things that makes it so common for us to get into these cases where we are fighting the nature of the language and making it harder for ourselves to do these kinds of things? Like, why is it that always seems to feel so painful until you've gone through this enough where it really clicks?
Yeah, I think there's a little bit two answers to that. So the cascade starts with, in the initial proposal, it's a cascade of style sheets, right? We've got multiple style sheets. They're coming from the browser, they're coming from the user setting preferences, and they're coming from us. So right away, we have 3 potential style sheets, and then each of us can add more. So we've got n number of style sheets, and somehow they have to all merge together and create a document. A big part of that is that the browser can do a lot of styling for us, give us some defaults, make a site readable. If you remove the browser styles completely, you can set on the star selector, set the all property to initial, and you will see no browser styles. And you'll see everything in the head of the document because those are all just HTML elements and they are display inline by default. And then the browser comes along and is like, hide all that stuff because we don't need that, and make some things block by default. Paragraphs should be block, sections should be block, etc. The browser is providing all of that stuff for us. And the cascade allows them to do that and allows us to just set a few things to build on what they've started. And it allows users to fit in there too. And importance is part of that. Importance exists for those. So the browser goes first, and then the user preferences, and then us. And importance is there mostly for the browser and user to say that some things are off limits for us. That's why importance exists. And then we start playing with it to do other things, but it exists for them to override us, which is great. I think fantastic. The user can say, no, I need the font size to be 24 pixels. Don't touch it, back off. But yeah, so the cascade is doing that. But there's sort of one part of the cascade that we have the most control over, and that's specificity. And specificity is a heuristic. So we've got this complicated thing where like the way that we select something, which to some extent we're just trying to get at the thing. And selectors are clever because we can select a bunch of things at once and we don't have to style each individual thing on the page. But the way that we decide to access the selected elements, whether we're using an ID or we're using a class, or we have these different choices, ways to select a thing. But then the way that we choose to select it impacts its weight in the cascade. And it's a clever solution where we say, likely the more specific you are in your selector, likely that should override other things. And that makes sense.
The more important it is, right? Like if I pick something by ID, I want to override the rules, right? Like usually,
Yeah, that makes some sense. But it breaks down at some point because there's only 3 layers of specificity. There's either it's an element name, which we can't create new element names until recently, or it's a class or attribute, which we have a lot of control over, or it's an ID, which we're only supposed to use once per page. So again, we have pretty limited control. So we've only got control in that middle bit. And so that gives us, so now we're arguing about how many classes and attributes we can use. And then we start loading styles randomly using JavaScript. We don't know that the order they're coming in. And then we add naming conventions like BEM that are helping us decide how many and how to name these classes and how many of them to use. And these two things conflict where we're at the point where now everybody's like, okay, we only use one class or one attribute. And then our styles are going to be completely based on the order things load. But then we're loading them in random order because that's what React does. Now we have no control in the cascade, and the cascade only feels like a struggle to us. And this was the reason that we added cascade layers, was like, okay, we should have some way to be just about layering, just about what is priority over what. That's not tied up with some other thing like how we select. So layers start to give us that. And hopefully that allows us to spread out in the cascade again. I think we've moved towards this narrower and narrower cascade, and it feels more and more claustrophobic. And I think if layers allow us to say, okay, we can use as many classes as we need. We can use IDs when we want them. We can actually be expressive with our selectors. And then we can use layering to handle the cascade. I think that gives us a lot more control. I think the other part of the thing is the cascade is all about the browser and user providing styles for our sites, right? So I think there's just a little bit of a capitalism isn't about the user defining your brand or getting to override your brand. So I think that's also a thing where if companies aren't telling us to care about that, it's hard to always push that we need to care about that.
Do you think that this was like a little bit of a technological failure, like the idea of important even being available, right? Like to this layer of the cascade. Do you think it would have been a net positive if we couldn't specify like
If
important
we
rules?
could do importance. I think it's interesting. So the initial proposal suggests we could have a percentage importance. And then percentage importance in the initial proposal is pretty wild. And you ended up with a weighted average of the various importances. Just,
I have a hunch everything would have been 100 all the time. Everyone's just max
yeah,
important.
exactly.
Yeah.
That was the fear. And how do you get a weighted average of two fonts? Although I wish we had solved that problem.
That'd be cool.
It'd be fun.
Yeah.
But so it got simplified down to 0 by default and 100 if you add the important flag. I like that importance is there for the other origins to override us. I hadn't really thought about could you remove it just for us? Although a big part of the pitch was also that all three are using the same language, and that the sense was that makes us all equally powerful. That initial proposal is all about this sort of balance of power and balance of concerns. Everything about CSS comes from how do we balance the desire to brand and the desire to make a thing readable for myself. Yeah.
I don't want to sound like overly pessimistic here because I do feel like this is getting better over time. And we've been focusing on how tricky this is and the tension between users and brands and all that stuff. But I feel like it's better. I think people are talking about even little stuff like spacing rules, the way alignment works, and maybe reactivity to some extent. But I think one could argue that was just necessitated because all of a sudden everybody was on cell phones all the time. But I think that this is better. And I feel devs at large are concerned with this stuff. Do you think that this is a problem, or do you think that the CSS ecosystem, people working on it, people using it a lot, are making headway on making the web more responsive to user preferences?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are. I think the tension is a little bit bigger. To do this appropriately requires consideration. I would say it doesn't require a lot of code, but it requires thinking through what is it that we need to give people control over and why, and how do things respond to different situations. And I think those are useful things for us to think about. And so I worry about tools starting to claim that they can just do it for us, where the tool is clearly not making those decisions with some sort of intent for how this is going to impact people. Yeah, I want to make sure that we're thinking through the problems and thinking through how to provide access to software and not just handing that off and saying, it made it look good on my screen. That's sort of fundamentally anti-web in my take.
Yeah. Do you think that these kind of tools that aim to make this easier, do you think there are good and bad flavors of these like heuristic tools? Oh, run this on your website. We'll tell you if your contrast and font sizes and everything are up to spec. Or do you think that those are generally positive?
Oh, I think, yeah, things like contrast checkers, things like Axe or something that you can run to, use whatever tools help you get there. What I'm more worried about is tools that help us not think about the issues. I love tools that help us find the issues, address them, see what's there, make those decisions. What I want to make sure that we're doing is understanding that everything we put into our software is decisions that are going to impact users. And so doing things that offload that decision making is dangerous. The decision making is the important part that we need to keep doing.
Yeah. I gotcha. Yeah, that's an interesting thought. What is that decision making? Like, can we quantify that a little bit? Say you're on a team, you're on the front end team for some entity, you're working for some business, and there's a little bit of leeway. You can do your accessibility thing. There's probably not a ton of business interest unless somebody gets a complaint or something. But
Yeah,
what
or a
is that
lawsuit.
balance? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, complaint is very broad. Yeah,
Yeah.
but how do you balance that?
Yeah, I think of that as the fundamental job description is caring about the user and knowing what to think about. That's the expertise that I bring. Anybody can look up on MDN how to write the CSS to make the background blue. That's not my expertise. That's something that I can do very quickly because I've been doing it for a while. But my expertise is in thinking through how is it going to impact people when I do it one way versus doing it another way. That is considerations like I probably do want to be running accessibility checkers. I also want to know that they can't check for everything and that they're going to give me a list of accessibility things that I'm going to have to do manually because there is no way to automate them because they're about like how easy or hard is this to do or how well does it work. That is a bit subjective, and that's where my expertise comes into play. So that's how I think of it. I'm happy to hand off to tools anything that just requires rote automation. But my expertise is in bringing that concern for what is the impact.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier, and I think this is, and I don't want to roll us back too far, but you mentioned earlier that this doesn't always mean more code, right? To like get these things out the door. And I feel like this is often the case in CSS in particular and programming at large, right? Like, I think sometimes it takes a lot more energy to write a little
Write
bit of
less
code
code.
that does
Yeah.
exactly what you want it to do.
Yeah, that old, this is a long letter because I didn't have time to write a short letter.
And I think that in CSS, like that's so much the case. You get like you see it time and time again. You get some bug report, and it's like, oh, this looks weird for this specific case, and like the novice, the more junior developer goes in and like handles that case versus, oh yeah, this is a problem with like my root level rules. I like change one thing here and it fixes everywhere this would occur. Do you think that you mentioned expertise and like knowing that, but I'm gonna push back once more on this kind of concept of it almost feels to me that it's so tricky to train that muscle. Like in CSS in particular, I don't know what it is. I think it is just like the way in which it's this declarative syntax and then just cascades and like applies with all this overhead. Is there something you'd recommend maybe that like people do to make this process easier instead of like always kind of having to figure out what the like zoom level is to make changes appropriately? Like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think a lot of people avoid setting preferences, avoid changing zoom in order to see what they think of as the default that most people are going to get. And it's great to see that default, but I like to set lots of preferences and change my zoom all the time so that I'm not just seeing the default thing. I'm seeing what happens when people are changing this, what happens at different screen sizes. But also, I think I rely heavily on, so the talk was called Hints and Suggestions, which is a phrase that comes up over and over again in all of the early proposals for design on the web. And the idea is that our styles have to be suggestions in that the user and user agent can override us. So what we're saying is just a suggestion. We don't have control over fonts or colors. We can suggest fonts and colors. And then hints, because there's a lot we can do to provide meaning to the browser that then allows it to do things for us. So I think of units as a good example of this. Or to take it to an extreme, text wrap pretty. Like what text wrap pretty does is something that you could do with a whole lot of work in JavaScript. And the goal of CSS is to do it by just being like,
Do the thing.
please make it pretty. And the less I can be specific about what that means, the more I'm leaving it up to the user and the user agent to solve the hard parts of the problem for a specific use case without me having to reconsider. I don't have to consider what pretty means on every device. The devices can decide that. So I think units are great at this. So when I want something to be the height of the window, I can either use one of the viewport height units, or I can try to calculate based on something like use a job and just use the meaningful thing. Don't say pixels if you mean M's. Don't say M's if you mean pixels. You can sometimes, like, people will make a lot of assumptions that 1M is 16 pixels And that's making a lot of assumptions. But the point for me is that they might both render at 16 pixels, but they mean different things. And I can provide those hints to the browser. I guess the expertise that I'm thinking about is knowing the different ways of saying things so that I'm providing the right subtext. And then I don't have to say, how should this move at different sizes? I've already said, this is based on the font size, or this is based on the viewport size, or this is based on the container size. And I'm setting up those algorithms in the first place in such a way that the browser can take it from there. And I don't have to write a lot of new code to figure out when a thing changes and respond to that change. And I just set up the algorithm in the first place using the right associations or something.
Yeah. And yeah, like one gets what they want. Then you have that pleasant experience where you zoom out for the first time and it's, oh yeah, everything looks good.
Yeah. Oh, it did the thing.
Yeah. And you're like, my impulses were mostly right. No, oh, there's one little thing, not
Right.
like the,
Yeah,
oh God,
exactly.
everything's
Exactly. Yeah. And remembering that progressive enhancement and accessibility, all these things, they're not on-off switches. They're fluid, and I'm not rebuilding my site for every individual potential user need and every single different device. I'm trying to come up with designs and systems that will respond automatically to most things. And then where I need to put in a couple of tweaks with the media query, and we're good to go.
Yeah. I think it's easy to kind of get intimidated because like a lot of this stuff, like it's cool if it can handle everything and be perfect out of the gate. That's a pretty lofty goal, especially on like a code basis, but just chip away at it, do what you can. Like, I think that it's always good to see those things and make stuff work as best we can. Cool. Okay, we're getting low on time. We have some quick lightning round questions. Have you done these before, Miriam?
I don't remember.
Okay,
Let's find out.
The goal is just 1 or 2 sentence answers on these things. I'm just going to fire a bunch at you. Perfect. Okay, first one. What's your favorite little known fact about the origins of CSS?
I maybe already gave it to you. It's the percentage values for importance and then the weighted averages. And you really have to go read that initial proposal. Cascading HTML style sheets is the name of the document. And down at the bottom of that document, he talks about adding these percentages to every declaration to say how much you care about the declaration. But then at the bottom, he's got a little ASCII art drawing of sliders with user styles on one side and author styles on the other side. And the idea that you could be like, for colors, for fonts, for each thing, you could slide it between and choose where in the range you want to be in the mix between author and user styles. Beautiful. I love it.
Yeah. It sounds so zany and wild.
Yeah.
I love it. What's one CSS feature you think is underused and deserves more love?
Grid is probably my top choice. One of the best features in CSS. And I think a lot of people came out of floats and went straight to Flexbox. And those two, Flexbox is similar to floats in a certain way. And so it was an easy shift. And then they thought, well, I don't need grids. Learn grids. They're amazing. You can do so much quicker. Grids are actually designed to do the thing that people are hacking Flexbox for. Yeah. Top choice.
I've been there. I've been knee deep in trying to make Flex do things it's not supposed to do. And they're like, should just use a grid.
Just use grid.
This is 2 lines. And I don't know why I was doing this. I'm with you. In one word, what's the spirit of good web design?
Agency?
Nice.
Yes.
Good word. Finish this sentence. The future of the web will be more...
God, I don't know. Am I being hopeful here or pessimistic?
Be optimistic.
Which way am I going? The future of the web will be more humane, accessible. Accessible? Let's go with accessible.
I like accessible. Humane's kind of good too, though. Like more broad almost. But yeah, I'm with it. I like them both. Okay, this is a fun one too. What old school web design practice do you secretly miss?
Oh, remember when sites would provide multiple alternate style sheets? I think a lot of browsers still have that, but not all of them. Like a drop down in one of the file menus where you can like select which I want that to come back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's cool. We're kind of there, but light and dark toggles are not the same thing.
It's not the same. So I want entirely new style sheets.
Yeah.
And I want you to provide 6 of them and I can choose.
Put the nav on the right side, left side.
Exactly.
Yeah, that kind of stuff was cool. Thank you so much for chatting with me, Miriam. It was a pleasure.
Thanks. Always great.
I enjoyed it as well.
Yeah.
Cool.